Today we're going to be talking about the presidency. The presidency, it's important to point out, was never really thought to be or supposed to be the most powerful institution in our government, yet at some times it has become just that. Our government was originally designed to be three branches that were all supposed to be equal, and even at the time when that idea was created, it was thought that the presidency would be more like not a part-time job, but more of a kind of a job that wasn't taken as seriously because, well, a lot of different things were going on at the time. But one important thing to keep in mind is we had just gotten rid of a monarch. And so the idea of having another monarch was not something that the founders of our country actually wanted. Well, part of the problem with that is, things change and evolution happens within a government. And the United States is not the government that the United States started out being. We're a lot bigger, and it's kind of interesting to wonder if the founding fathers would have actually thought that we would end up being as big as we are today. They tried to prepare for it by setting up the institutions that we have today, and kind of the rest of our civilization has grown those institutions since then. So, I mean, it's not exactly the same thing that it was when we started out, but there is some difference, and some of it is still, the foundation is still there as if it was supposed to be designed this way, because in a sense, it actually was. So it took many different circumstances, like the Civil War, different wars that we've actually had, the war on terror, terrorism itself, all of these kinds of things, the coronavirus, all sorts of different kind of things to happen to cause government to change and the presidential institution to become a lot more stronger or weaker, depending on the circumstances. But what's important to keep in mind when we talk about the presidency, because people kind of forget this, is the succession of the presidency is not what a lot of people actually think it is. As a matter of fact, when Ronald Reagan had a assassination attempt by John Hinckley during his administration, the government kind of fell apart for a second. The Secretary of State jumped up, Alexander Haig, and stated that he was in charge, that he basically was the next person in government to take over, because the vice president was also incapacitated at that particular time, or not available for actual service. And so what ended up happening is he claimed that he was the next in line to succeed the president. Well, it took the Speaker of the House showing up and explaining to him that he has no idea how the Constitution actually works, that he was wrong. Because as it turns out, the Secretary of State is not the next person in line. So it's important to kind of point out who is the succession. So we have the president, we have a vice president. Our president is, at this particular time, Donald Trump. Our vice president is Mike Pence. Then we have a Speaker of the House, who is Nancy Pelosi. Our president pro tempore, and I've mentioned this before when we were talking about Congress, is actually the leader of the Senate, who is not actually the vice president, because the vice president is actually the leader of the Senate. And that is Mitch McConnell. And so that's why you hear his name, Nancy Pelosi's name quite often, because they're the two leaders of the two different houses. After that, then comes the Secretary of State, who actually at this time happens to be Mike Pompeo. The next person after that is the Secretary of the Treasury, who's Stephen Mnuchin, who you may recognize as making a lot of inroads on the news from statements about basically the virus and all sorts of other things, including the economy itself. And then after him comes the Secretary of Defense, who's Mark Esper. And so Now, these could change at any time depending on the president removing some of them, not the Senate or the House, but the secretaries, because they're all part of his cabinet. He puts them together. He puts them together and decides who they actually are, and they get confirmed by the Senate. That's kind of how the process actually works. But that is the order of secession. Now, in order to secede, you have to actually be able to serve as president. So you have to actually be born in the United States. So if one of those people was not born in the United States, they would not be part of the actual secession. So there have been situations like that in the past. And whenever the president or holds the State of the Union address, what they'll do is they'll bring everybody from government in and then leave one person in the line of secession, sometimes like the Secretary of Education, this is probably like 7 or 9 on the list, and then to make sure that somebody can secede just in case something actually happens and like everyone, you know, hopefully doesn't ever happen, but in case something like that should ever happen. So remember, it's important to understand who can actually be a president. Now, to be a president, there aren't a whole lot of requirements other than you have to be born in the United States or a territory of the United States. There was some question as to whether or not John McCain was actually allowed to actually run for president because he was actually born on a military post overseas. That is considered U.S. property, and so whenever there's questions like that, that's basically the default is kind of what they go back to. The other thing is they have to be 35 years of age. So it's kind of like we talked about before with Congress. To be a member of the House of Representatives, you need to be 25. In order to be a member of the Senate, you need to be 30, and then you had another 5 years to that to be president, which would be 35. So I think what they were probably thinking in the way back in the day was, you know, maybe that would be the line of secession that somebody would, or the line of offices somebody would actually choose, go from the House of Representatives to the Senate to the presidency. Hasn't really happened that much. It has kind of touched on it a couple of times with a few presidents, but most of the time that's generally not happened. And also they have to be a resident in the United States for 14 years. So those are basically the 3 rules. And anybody else, you don't have to be a lawyer, don't have to be anything. That's all you have to do in order to become president. Remember, if you're one of those people in the line of secession and you don't meet any of those qualifications, then when the seceding happens, it'll just skip you and go to the next person. So as a president, you have all sorts of use of the White House and staff. There's a lot of benefits to it. Fleet of automobiles, you know, Air Force One, all sorts of everything as Air Force One or Vehicle One, Marine One, all the different vehicles. Basically, you have complete use of those as the president. And so that also serves to protect his or her family as well. They also have what's called Camp David, which is it's a retreat that's set aside designed for like peace summits, but it can also just be used for vacation if they wanted to. Of course, free dental, medical care, stuff like that. And so it's a nice job to get, but I'm sure there's a lot of work involved. So historically, every president has been a white male, and most of them have been Protestant. Although Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, was a Roman Catholic, which was a little different. It was kind of like a huge scandal at the time. In 2008, we had the first Democratic primary, which is between a white woman who was Hillary Clinton and an African-American man, which was Barack Obama. And Barack Obama actually won and became our first African-American president. Other than that, one other kind of anomaly to the whole situation is during 2012, the Republican candidate, Mitt Romney, was actually of Mormon background, which is a different religion than we generally had of the different ones that run through. So the idea of being a president comes from Article 2 of the Constitution, which is specifically about the presidential position itself. So all of the stipulations are pointed out there, Article 2 of the Constitution. The president serves as the commander-in-chief, which means the president has the power to deploy the armed forces. And in some cases, we've had some presidents think that means they have the power to start wars. And Congress actually has the power to declare war, but because their inability to use that power and president's inability to inform Congress what they're actually going to do, sometimes presidents drive wars and then Congress has to like immediately follow up and actually declare it in their stead. And so we've had a lot of our war on terror and all that kind of stuff that was going on during this period. Congress didn't declare any of that, but basically gave blank checks to presidents at the time to do whatever they had to do, and it's been that way ever since. And it's the important thing about the president's power is once the president takes a certain amount of power, it's really, really hard to take that power back. And so if you have an overbearing president that really likes power and does something with power, once that power is used, if Congress doesn't stop the president by going through the court system, which sometimes they have, in most recent years, we haven't had too much of that lately because basically Congress has divided itself between two different parties. And when one party is behind the president's side, it's really hard to get the other party to actually garner any kind of defense against changing the status quo. Also, the president is considered the head of state, which means he or she represents the state pretty much in all affairs going forward. The Congress does make final decisions on that, but they are not the ones actually going to other countries and creating treaties. And should they do that, they can actually be called on some crimes for doing things they should definitely not be doing. He's also considered the chief diplomat, which kind of falls into that same category. He's also known as and this is kind of a weird one if you think about it, because he's not this in reality, but he's known as the chief legislator, which doesn't mean he does a lot of legislation, but what he'll do is he'll come up with ideas for legislation and then usually have somebody in his party that serves in that particular institution, like the House or the Senate, will be the one who actually proposes that particular piece of legislation in his or her name. And so that's kind of how it generally works. There is another little legislative process that the executive uses, the president being the executive. And it's not really a legislative responsibility, but it's an executive responsibility. And that's basically executive orders. So a president who can't get something done through Congress will actually go through and make a blanket order that this needs to be done this way. Like some of the more mundane ones are like, outlawing broccoli or something to that effect, or all kids need to eat better, those kinds of things. Although it's gotten to the point now where it's now using immigration, which generally was not supposed to be done to actually do legislation, but it's becoming more and more of an issue because Congress has become such a roadblock against the president. So again, it depends on how much power the president's willing to take and how much he or she's willing and able to get away with. He or she is also considered the party leader for whatever political party he or she happens to be part of. So like Barack Obama was the party leader for the Democrats, whereas Donald Trump is the party leader for the Republicans. So that president then represents that party going forward, and that's why the party always tends to side with a president that's in power. Sometimes it hasn't worked out well, because sometimes the president works too hard against Congress, even against its own party. This happened during the Carter administration. Carter was a kind of a free thinker that had different ideas than what government actually wanted to do, and government, which was, I mean, it was controlled by the Democrats at the time, but they didn't like certain things that he wanted to do, so there was a lot of fight back and forth between the two of them. So when it came to Ronald Reagan running against Carter for the next election, Ronald Reagan kind of gave the idea that Carter was ineffective and couldn't get anything done, which he wasn't wrong. And so therefore, Reagan kind of got in pretty easily. And so that sort of problem kind of causes all sorts of problems. So a lot of times most people see the president as a figurehead. So you'll see him like sometimes out at baseball games throwing the first pitch or something to that effect. It's a lot of it's because the president is seen as the morale person, or they call it the party pulpit, which means, or bully pulpit, which means he stands up in front of the audience, and bully pulpit is a place where he can make statements, pronouncements, and all these sorts of things, and it kind of gets things done because he or she is the president, and therefore the name has a little bit of power recognition to it, and so things kind of get done. So there's a famous story of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where one of his friends came up to him and said, he needed help getting a job because he was having difficulty getting a job. So Franklin pulled him aside and says, well, here, let me help you. And so the friend went there for the idea of Franklin to give him a job, but that wasn't what Franklin actually did. What he did is he went up on stage with him, hugged him on stage and talked to him about this is his friend. And that's all he had to do. And the guy had a job. So you can see kind of how that actually works. Now, the president has a lot of different powers that are important to kind of point out as well. There's the idea that he has specified powers that are actually in the Constitution itself. And then over time, he's kind of added powers that generally didn't have in the beginning. So he's also the person who proposes and ratifies treaties, which means he proposes it, Congress approves it, or the Senate approves it, and then he ratifies it by making it actual law. And then as the executive, he uses his branch of government to carry out all of those treaties and whatever laws that were actually created, plus the laws created by Congress. He has the power to grant reprieves and pardons, pretty much blanket. We found out during the Trump impeachment hearing, there was all sorts of conjecture that Trump could actually overturn his impeachment by pardoning himself, which legally that could not happen. But again, remember how I said before, things that happen with the president, they have precedent on what happens going forward. So if a president does something and doesn't get challenged by it, basically it's now the way things are until it changes next time around with somebody else or with the same person. He also has the power of the veto, which means if something comes in as legislation, if he doesn't like it, he can veto it, and therefore it doesn't get passed. Although a 2/3 majority in the House and Senate can actually turn it into an actual law. Then he can't do anything about it. So part of the problem is, and this has happened in the past, is what happens then? If Congress makes a law, the president vetoes it, and then it becomes a law because they override his veto, it's going to have a really hard time getting done because, remember, the person who actually enforces that law is the president. So you end up in a really unique situation. We ran into that with after the Depression, And with the New Deal legislation, a bunch of stuff had that exact same situation happen, and it got through. A lot of legislation got past the president in the very beginning, and basically the president wasn't backing it up. And so, like I said, it all depends on the situation and kind of how things go. Sometimes it goes through the court system to get things done. In during the civil rights movement, there was all sorts of back and forth on this. And so how it ends up is kind of how things will be going forward into the future. And it will also define future presidential power. So vetoes haven't worked too well, because generally a president's not going to veto something unless he or she's convinced that it's not going to get overridden. If it gets overridden, that's extremely embarrassing for a president. And one of the other items about vetoes that we should talk about is called a line item veto, which was the idea if you had legislation and the president didn't like it, he could go through and go, I like the legislation, but I don't like this piece of it. So therefore, I'm vetoing this. And so Congress actually gave that as a part of the law. They made a law saying that was legal. And then basically, the first time it was actually, they originally was done by the Republicans trying to put it forth in kind of a legislation that thought that the Republicans were actually going to gain power. Well, the president at that time was Clinton, and Bill Clinton. And so what happened was he tried to line item veto something, and what ended up happening is they challenged it to the Supreme Court, and basically they struck down the line item veto. So even though they were the ones that put it in there, they were the ones who challenged it and literally got it taken down. So now presidential powers, like I've mentioned, there's a whole bunch of them that are necessary because of the government and the way that the government was designed. But remember, president was never supposed to be the most powerful institution in the government. The president was supposed to represent the person who carries out all of the duties of government. And so our early presidents kind of thought, that's what my job is. I'm more of the person sitting here taking care of government, not really the person deciding how government does what it does. In a lot of other countries, we have what are differences between prime ministers and like a president. Their presidents in a lot of proportional representation systems tend to be somebody who's elected to be the figurehead of the government and kind of like tells, this is what we should do going forward. And then your prime minister, who's actually in charge of your legislative department, who's actually becomes the leader there, is then is like the House leader, but becomes literally the de facto leader of the government. So the real power is the prime minister, whereas the figurehead power is the president. Whereas our system, we don't have that set up this way because we have the equal branches of government, and being equal branches of government, it never puts forth that idea of making that actually happen. So again, like I mentioned, one of the problems, or it's not really a problem, but one of the interests in the presidential system is that some presidents take advantage of all the little different nuances of their position and then make the position even more powerful. Other presidents basically think they have too much power and shouldn't have that much power. So kind of like a George Washington approach to, the Cincinnatus. I think I've mentioned it before, of where I only want to govern as long as I have to, and then I'm done, and then I'm moving off and becoming a farmer. And so we'll have those kind of dichotomies going back and forth. So, but one of the things to keep in mind is when it comes to the power itself, sometimes the government, not just the presidency, but the government in general, kind of dictates what kind of president you're going to have. So like right now, we have what's called a divided government, which means the House and the Senate are between two different branches, two different parties in political power. You have the Democrats and the Republicans. And if one has one House and one has the Senate, you end up what's called a divided government. So getting something done can sometimes become really difficult for a president who's not capable of working with your divided government. So sometimes you need like a really charismatic president that can cause people to do things that they wouldn't normally do. If you have somebody that's confrontational to everyone, nothing's going to get done, and you're going to end up with not only a divided government, but a government that basically staggers and does nothing. And so the other thing is you got to remember that the Congress and the president have different constituencies. And so the president is pretty much relying on the entire country as its constituents, and some better than others. Some presidents focus only on their party and basically become very selective in what they do, whereas others become open and realize, I became president to serve everybody, and then does their best to do just that. And sometimes their decisions can be based off the concept of how that works. Now, one of the advantages a strong president actually has, and like some of the times where we've seen this happen, is like the war on terrorism. Before the war on terrorism, the presidency was becoming a weaker institution. And so when the 9/11 attacks happened, the president actually had to become a lot stronger, a lot more powerful, and basically government had to respond as such. And Congress kind of took a back seat to government, whereas before it was kind of leading a lot of what was actually happening. We have another concept which is important to keep in mind because it's very controversial, and it's executive privilege. And executive privilege means the president, because of his or her status and position, has certain things that can be done that nobody can question or even really look into. And that has happened a couple of times with presidents saying that they have executive privilege and you're not allowed to do anything. Happened during the Nixon administration, when basically Nixon tried to stop the Watergate tapes from getting out. Unfortunately, Congress and the Supreme Court ruled against him, so, well, we kind of know how that worked out. We had the same thing happen during the Trump impeachment trial. He claimed executive privilege and refused to let any of his people actually testify. And so in that one, he got away with it. Because again, like I mentioned before, if your Congress is behind you and you're the leader of that party that's running an institution where this takes place, that'll happen. In that particular situation, the House was Democrat, so it was very much against him and brought the articles of impeachment, whereas the Senate was on his side because it's his party, the Republicans, and basically exonerated him in the end. It was very much a partisan thing, all the way down. Few outliers that actually voted with conscience, but most of it was done strictly down the idea of party loyalty more than anything else. So the president, in order to get his job done, his or her job done, has what's called the presidential cabinet. And what it is a group of people that he or she appoints to make, decisions or to help the president make future decisions. So the cabinet has evolved over time. Like we started off with a Secretary of War. We don't have that anymore. It's now called the Secretary of Defense. And so we've changed different names, and defense has actually been broken down into all the different branches of our government. And so we have the same, every branch or every member of the cabinet gets elevated to a position of being really important. And so these cabinets will actually serve as people who give the ideas to the president going forward. Or they'll take the ideas that the president has and run them out to the rest of the organizations that they actually run. And it works pretty well. Again, we're stuck with whether or not you have a president that wants to take too much responsibility and actions on his or her part, or you have one that likes to kind of take a step back and let people do what they have to do in order to get things done. And we've had all sorts of different kinds of presidents over the year. So let's talk about the executive office of the president. It was established in 1939, and the idea was they wanted a more consistent branch of people that actually do the things that they actually need to do. So rather than just kind of, I'm hiring my campaign manager and that's going to run the government, basically you have, chief of staff and all of these different positions that actually make sure all of the institutions of government get done. In the early days, almost everything was pretty much appointed by, party affiliation. Now it's actually appointed by the president himself or herself, based on what we hope is meritocracy rather than, I'm rewarding you because you're a friend of mine or you're somebody that has all sorts of similar business interests. Sometimes it's been both ways. It all depends on the president and kind of how things actually get done. So the White House office, which is, like I said, serves as the connection from the president to kind of the rest of the government. It's where most of the stuff actually gets done, and it has the most direct contact with the president. Not everyone can have access to the president because, there's only a limited amount of time this person could do. And so, like I said, it's led by a chief of staff. It usually includes the press secretary. The press secretary these days sometimes hovers in whether or not he or she is a legitimate part of the staff or not. It all kind of depends on where they are in the pecking order of different things. But generally, the press secretary has been part of it, and so press secretary serves as kind of the conduit between the president and the rest of the people. And so with some presidents, they just don't like dealing with the media at all. And so sometimes you'll have much more of a standoffish approach, kind of like during the Trump administration. Very difficult to actually get one-on-one with the president, whereas other presidents have been a lot easier. Other presidents as well have had some of the same problems. So it's not unusual. It's just, it all depends on what happens is people get used to one style of president. Next one comes along and does something a little bit different. And so it causes people to think that this is totally out of control and different. And it's just different. That's all it is. And the next president comes along will probably be completely different as well. Remember, they're all individuals with their own individual philosophy and process for how they get things done. One of the other major members of the executive committee, the executive staff, is the National Security Council, which is led by the National Security Advisor. Ours tends to waver from time to time as to who it is. It's kind of expected after a certain amount of time, it needs to be an established person because this is the person who's literally kind of running the connection between your president, your government, and your intelligence services, which is where a lot of the stuff in your government actually gets done. The other thing is, one of the other members of the organization of the executive branch is the vice president. And so the vice president, who at this time is Mike Pence, like I said, he has other responsibilities as well, one of them being he's the leader of the Senate. So when he's doing that particular role, he's there orchestrating over what's going on there. When he serves pretty much as part of the executive branch, he's doing things that usually the president has told him needs to be done, and so he carries out specific functions. Now, some vice presidents have been very kind of pushed out of the way by certain presidents because presidents just don't want them getting anything done. And so, like, you'll have like Obama and Biden were not seen quite often together all the time. And so Mike Pence right now, you're not seeing him at all. Basically, anything going on with President Trump, basically Mike Pence is generally just kind of, yes, that's what we're doing. So it all depends on what particular presidents you have as to kind of how things are going on. Now, there is one thing that's really important to kind of keep in mind with vice presidents and that's the 25th Amendment. So this can actually cause presidential secession, which is forced secession. And this would be the cabinet has to agree with the vice president and basically just claim that your president is incapacitated or not capable of serving correctly. And there's all sorts of interpretations of how that is. And so it's very rarely invoked and rarely even suggested like it will be. But it would take something horrific to actually happen for me to imagine it would ever actually occur. But it's there set in actual constitutional writing in case it should ever have to happen. So that's your presidency in a nutshell. And so it's a huge organization. So much has changed over time. It was not what it was originally designed to be by the founding fathers. And it's probably not going to be the same thing in years to come. That's kind of how the evolution of the position goes. Congress is not really that much different than it used to be. Neither is the Supreme Court. It's still pretty much the same institution that it was when it first started. But the presidency, it ebbs and flows for all particular tides. And so it's really important to kind of pay attention to what's going on at that particular time because it may make a huge influence on what happens going forward.